Okay. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for tonight's, panel talk, fireside chat, with two speakers who I'm really excited for us to be able to hear from today. Just a little bit about me. I'm a lens-based visual artist. Again, I'm also the outreach and advocacy coordinator for CARFAC Ontario. What I'd like to do is just really quickly, read the bios of both of the speakers and just let you know a bit about them and their work, and then we'll lead into the talk. So our first speaker is Vince Rozario. So Vince is an independent curator, critic, writer, arts administrator, and community organizer focusing on issues of decolonizing the canon, multiple modernities, queer diasporas, and transnational futures. Their writing deals with issues around community accountability, representation, equity in the Canadian contemporary art sphere. Their work aims to explore modes of art production and circulation that circumvent traditional modes of exhibition dissemination. Our second speaker, I'm also very excited to have and introduce, is Zainub Verjee. So Zainub is the laureate of the 2020 Governor General's Visual and Media Arts Award for outstanding contribution to the arts in Canada. She's currently involved in the national campaign on basic income and is the co-author of the public letter to the Prime Minister of Canada on basic income guarantee. As an artist, critic, writer, and a keynote speaker, arts administrator with expertise in cultural policy and cultural diplomacy, for over 4 decades, she's contributed to international and national policies and legislation pertaining to the cultural sector, including international instruments like the status of the artist and cultural diversity. She continues to work on issues of artist labor, artist income, racial equity, cultural planning, intellectual property, digital ecosystems of art, cultural institutions, cultural diplomacy, and cultural trade. Zainub is the former executive director of the Western Front, and her work on the British Columbia Arts Board has led to the formation of the British Columbia Arts Council, as well as she has contributed to the formation of many other institutions. So as an active member of civil society, she was the Vancouver moderator for the Spicer Commission Citizens Forum on Canada's Future. And currently, she is the executive director of the Ontario Association of Art Galleries in Toronto. And so these are both two speakers that we're really excited to have. And, both as emerging and established artists, we're really honored to join us today. And we really want to engage artists who are deeply engaged in equity issues, both within and beyond the artistic community, and who are also willing to be disruptive and shake the table through their various forms of critique in the name of kind of creating a more equitable cultural landscape. So I'm really excited to hear more from Vince and Zainub, and I will pass it off to you both now.
Great, terrific. Thank you to CARFAC Ontario, to Jason, to Roya for inviting us to this conversation. I'm really delighted to be having this exchange with Vince. And we had so many rounds of conversation leading up to this evening, and it's been a really interesting journey to get us to the forum here tonight. So I think Jason, has kind of pointed out, and we're all in it, so we know what we're talking about in terms of, what it is that we're trying to address. But so tonight's conversation, in a way, is really to offer some contours, as it were, a way to think through this moment that we find ourselves in and look at how we could forge a way forward. This moment is it is historic in one sense, and of course it's episodic in another. And I really hope that that at the end of this conversation that there are some takeaways that we can leave you with on what we've spoken about, and how you yourselves then can take that and think about how we can, as a sector, as a community, as a country, as a province, as a network, forge our ways forward. So I want to get right into it. I'm going to begin by addressing sort of the 3 key operative words in the motion of the evening: the crisis as a catalyst for change. So what is this crisis? For me, the way I see it is that it informs a certain kind of unexpectedness. It's about uncertainty. uncertainty, and it's also about the instability. And the instability is really when the status quo can't be sustained, and it's a threat to the old ways of doing things. And it's in fact, it's the instability which is what indicates that change or some kind of transition is imperative. And the way that I see it is that the crisis is when this unexpectedness, the uncertainty, and the instability impact the individual, social, and the state. The catalyst, I think, it's pretty straightforward. It really kind of functions as a fulcrum point and enables the transition. But what I really want to talk about, and I think it's really important, is the change. How do we know when a change has occurred even, right? What are the elements that actually constitute change? And these are, in my estimation, they're the shifts in power relations, individual, social, and political. They're establishing or defining a new state of the social. And this change actually is enacted by listening through the give and take, through the push and pull, and really through the contestation that we are in. And the phases of change include an emergence of new ideas and realities. It's a coalescence of forces. It's also the institutionalization of the ideas and forces. And then a new status quo emerges, and eventually it falls into decline, and that's inevitable. So when change is invoked, paradoxically, the change is actually invoking to maintain the status quo. And there's a nuance here about this circulation, right? It's a circulatory thing between change and the status quo. And so when we talk about change, we need to be sure that we're making a really clear departure. Today we're facing three crises: the public health one, the pandemic, obviously the social, we know the social upheaval, and it's been foregrounded by movements from indigenous decolonization movements, the Black Lives Matter and others. And of course the economic, and the precarity has been accentuated by this pandemic. Now all three directly impact the very nature of politics we embrace and define. Now having said this, I want to just lay out the contours in 3 points in my opening statement. One is manifestation. We're not really able to comprehend the nature of the crisis, primarily because we keep falling into the trap of responding to the manifestations of crisis as a problem itself and not the crisis. And this is really significant because the media thrives on manifestation. I think we know this, right? The whole kind of corroded idea of news value wants to focus on manifestation and not the crisis. And social discourse is often aided by the media and its focus on the manifestation and its manipulation in conjunction with social media and all the compulsions of electoral politics. Let's just look at some examples. We've seen apologies take place. They're very performative in nature. We've seen statements of solidarity on systemic racism just roll off, right? Roll out, one after the other. We've seen tokenisms very recently and over the last while in forms of appointments that take place, right? So, it's really important that we understand this idea of manifestation and how we are embedded in responding to that rather than the crisis itself. And it's imperative to understand how the norms of these social are established and also the language we're using to speak of the crisis, let alone to imagine the change. The second thing I want to kind of focus on is the discourse. Stemming from this proclivity of ours to kind of embrace and respond to the manifestation, we're generating a particular discourse and across different modalities of institutions, disciplines, community, network. And I think there's two kinds of discourses that are at play. For example, there's a socio-political discourse and there's the corporate management discourse. But what I want to highlight in this situation is that we're really being led by the corporate business leaders and by that discourse, and that has what has become very influential, more influential. And we see this manifestation at many levels and instances, whether it's in philanthropy or social issues or politics. And the public actually tends to listen to what business leadership has to say. I mean, you can see it in the statements on systemic racism, right? It began with corporate bodies, and it's part of their public relations work. So, I think that there's been this kind of overbearing of business leadership on social issues, and it actually stems from a moment in history in 1987. We can come back to that. I think that the deeper the crisis, the stronger the tendency among the apologists of the system towards self-delusion. And it's this self-delusion is often structured in the binary of problem-solution, wherein to any challenge, the retort is, what is your solution? Find a solution. We hear government tell us this all the time, right? We have to find the solutions. And it's actually the state of denial. This state of denial is a characteristic feature of dominant ideologies and may be indispensable in the effort to restore hegemony, but it also runs the risk of leaving the ideology exposed, particularly when its own diktats seem to compound the crisis rather than resolve it. Now, one of the other things that I really kind of, and I'd want to just say that the same kind of strident self-delusion can be seen in the arts and culture. It's in education, it's in social welfare, and the neoliberal assumptions about their role in the economy don't not only offer no plausible solutions, either social, political, or educational, but especially to the present crises, but also involve kind of a deep, demeaning view of the role of individuals in society. And I want to talk about the third thing, which is the idea of work. I wanted to share this with you because we see that under the umbrella of reform, we keep hearing these buzzwords, and one of them is innovation and its exigencies that have tapered ever more finely to the perceived needs of the labour market. And we also, similarly, the skills development agenda is another buzzword of neoliberalism. Have you noticed how pervasive this agenda is and how tightly controlled it is? And you can see this, for example, in its prevalence from the funding of community art projects to the education sector to the work that we do. And this skills learning outcome model has become a uniform point of reference for a cluster of other management-driven concepts which have contributed in the neoliberal era to the transformation of the landscape of culture, social, and education sectors. And the most important impact has been on the political segregation that we say into this sort of tripartite division of work, labor, and jobs. And the current politics is driven by the concept of jobs while work has been left out. And this has had a direct impact on the idea of the work of artists. I'm going to talk a little more about this as the talk develops, but these are sort of my opening thoughts and the contours of how I've been thinking about this. And now I'm going to turn it over to Vince to share some of his thoughts on this and sort of open up his statements.
Thank you, Zainub. And I'd like to start off by thanking Roya for making this encounter happen. It's been tremendously enriching and very, very edifying to speak to Zainub over the last few days. We've had a lot of back and forth, a lot of very rich conversations, so I'm very grateful for that. I'll differ somewhat to the framework and concepts that Zainub's laid out in the introduction of the talk. As somebody who is still emerging, I definitely don't have the same long systemic view that Zainub is bringing to this discussion. But what I think I can do is to speak to all of these elements that have been laid out in my own experience as an arts and culture worker, and sort of working within various capacities as an organizer in community arts, as somebody that works at a university art gallery, as an independent curator and a critic. And, like a lot of you, like a lot of arts professionals today, I also have a day job, which is as a fundraising coordinator at a social agency in one of the worst hit areas, that operates in one of the worst hit areas in Toronto in terms of the pandemic. So in all of these capacities, I feel as though the idea that this catastrophe is in many ways episodic, and in many ways foreseen, that seems to ring very true for me. Particularly just before the pandemic, I took on a couple of writing assignments and went to my hometown Dhaka in Bangladesh, where there was a big international art event happening. It is now one of the livelier emerging markets in South Asia, and this biennial positioned itself as kind of socially conscious and politically motivated and contemplating futurities, and yet it was so entirely kind of detached from its material reality. And what I ended up encountering halfway across the world is a lot of pieces that I'd actually seen in the year previously in Canada. So really, it's this packaging of a kind of neoliberal rhetoric of change that is being sort of exported globally. So that to me is like the macro view of what's happening at the moment. And in the end, really, the writing assignments that I took, I couldn't actually finish the essays because just the scope of my own horror and shock at like the sheer contrast of what was happening. We can maybe get into some of that in the actual conversation. Besides that, I also organize a queer DIY arts and culture festival called Bricks and Glitter. We work primarily with racialized queer and trans artists, a lot of people from disability communities or from economically marginalized communities. And it's essentially a way of trying to encapsulate all of the queer voices and talent and ingenuity and care and abundance that often gets left behind in more mainstream spheres. And particularly in that context, what has been really challenging for us as a small festival, as a small DIY operation, is to address the severe shortage of resources that our community was hit with at the beginning of the pandemic. And, hats off to all the wonderful people doing work at Bricks and Glitter at Unit 2 as well, which is a community-run space, which is directly opposite from the Museum of Contemporary Art here in Toronto. And essentially, whereas we were originally going to take a year off and sort of plan for next year and have a larger event next year, we felt that given the lack of economic opportunities and given the lack of really of any kind of like professional development opportunities for a massive sector of emerging artists, not just in the visual arts, but in music and theater, etc., that remained kind of unfulfilled. So over the course of 2 weeks, we offered, some 5 or 6 workshops. We represented work by about 50 artists, and we were able to pay them equitably in a way that quite frequently larger institutions do not. And really, in trying to do that, what became very apparent is, again, that we were dealing with so many new kind of manifestations of the crisis as it came up that we really weren't able to think long-term about sustainability in the same way, and to meet the challenges that often face grassroots initiatives, which is incorporating or acquiring a trustee or acquiring sort of the corporate derived structures which allow access to consistent funding. So this is also a pressing need that I've been feeling. In terms of my work in social services, you know, something about this whole crisis felt very on the way when I started my job last year. I realized that my agency actually had a pandemic preparedness plan because the area and its public health infrastructure was so poor that any kind of minor pandemic would have an outsized effect. So, after SARS, they drafted a policy. The local economy is always the worst hit because it's deeply dependent on manufacturing. These are some of the most heavily policed neighborhoods in the city. This is North and Northwest Toronto, roughly speaking. I also do some work in Scarborough. And essentially, the kind of mainstreaming of a certain kind of discourse around police brutality and Black lives has been felt so severely in these areas for so long. I mean, in the year leading up to this, I had two coworkers who lost members of their families to gun violence. Just the scope and impact of the tragedy was outsized from the very beginning. So in the context of this sort of larger scope of issues, what the status quo has been to sort of provide these very small concessions, right? The Liberal government has announced about a number of strategies and funds for Black Canadians, but as the person who writes these grants and applies for them, and also sometimes works in collaboration with a body of Black-led organizations, we were able to calculate that really the total funding for all of these causes amounts to something less than 8% of all of the tax dollars that are collected from Black Canadians across the country, right? So this kind of hints at the tokenistic and neoliberal nature of change as it's invoked currently. And so I'm hoping that in this discussion, we can think our way around some of these issues. We can think our way out of the status quo and perhaps critically examine what we mean when we talk about change. As far as what makes me hopeful, though, in all of this has been the sort of groundswell of grassroots movements, from Not Another Black Life to the rent strike and organizing around housing to organizing around encampments, the work that Friends of Chinatown Toronto have been doing. In all of these contexts, the arts and creativity and creative solutions to addressing the problem have taken front and center stage. However, at the same time, there is an alternate current of cultural production where the arts pacifies and renders us complacent to the current catastrophe. There is an aestheticization of what's currently happening in the world right now, to the point of just becoming a thing that delivers pleasure, or a kind of sublime frisson, if you want to call it that. And that for me has been quite distressing, in the sense that I've attended now, I think, 3 curatorial roundtables where curators mostly talked about their challenges to mounting programming at a time when, there are massive public health crises happening in cities across the country. We've been seeing basic concessions to accessibility that accessibility advocates have been talking about for years. Finally, some people were just bragging about doing a described audio for many of their pieces in their exhibition, and how revolutionary and unique that was. Of course, anybody who's involved in the disability arts community knows that this has been something that has been asked for years. Not only that, we've positioned, paying your employees enough in a time of crisis and providing them funds for professional development as some sort of revolutionary measure. So what I'm kind of struggling to sort of bridge together are all of these fissures in the current system. And so I'm hoping to think through some of that with Zainub. So yeah, I think we'll open up our discussion for today. The first point on our agenda is the idea of discourse, how we've gotten to this place that we're currently in. And I would like to ask Zainub about kind of the history of some of the political processes that have led to this because of her extensive work on the history of Canadian cultural policy, the Massey Report, etc.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I want to just say, just to kind of talk about that discourse piece and how it's been created and all these different things. Like you mentioned the looting and you mentioned, all of these things and through the decades, in a way, when I was listening to you just now, I was thinking like, this is a deja vu, right, for me. And it's really great to be having this intergenerational conversation because as you're speaking, we've had different, we've been in different conditions, let's say, to respond in the ways that we have, whether it's been, the bashing of queer people, or whether it was like heavy censorship in the galleries, whatever it is that we've had to fight. And so my sense about this is that, again, I'm taking it back to the discourse and how we've been so manipulated, right? And we've heard the different kind of, the narratives, right? There's the curatorial discourse, and you talked about that, like you've attended 3 of these sessions, but then the political processes that have produced its own discourses through policy and commissions like the Massey, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's report, and, even if you read the Citizenship Guide to Canada, it's quite revealing. But what I wanted to just kind of bring back, and I'm looking at the larger again, is, we've talked about what has been, the underlying current and what has come to the fore in the social, for example. Like when I was saying, I'm not surprised that in the name of fighting systemic racism, we've landed with a political segregation of a multiracial Canadian society. And that in one sentence of trying to fight systemic racism, the multiracial solidarities have been broken, and new categories have come to roost, as it were, right? And what is this new reality? It's this kind of tripartite foregrounding of Indigenous, Black, and of course white. And, we saw this even in the recent speech from the throne, right? And then as soon as that's put out there, immediately, institutions follow it like template, right? They absorb it. The government, first of all, has already used words like, intersectionality and all of this sort of stuff, and then it's completely absorbed by institutions. And so this legacy for me, for example, this division actually is a legacy of colonial statecraft. It's to define and rule. And that's literally what it's done, right? And this really kind of comes out of like this mid-19th century crisis of the empire, which attracted the attention of British intellectuals and it led to a reconception of the colonial mission, like to reforms in India or British Malay or the Dutch East Indies. And the new politics were inspired by Sir Henry Maine, and they established established that natives were bound by geography and custom rather than history and law, and made this the basis of its administrative practice. And that's what this tokenism is all about, through administrative practice of appointments. And it's really been fine-tuned, over the decades. You can see it, like for us, it was very much, in broadcasting, we used to have these discussions about it. It's like, fights for Knowledge Network and CBC to have people of color, and now you have TV anchors of color, but that doesn't make any dent in the primacy of the inherited news value media organizations, right? It doesn't do anything. So what? It's completely ineffective. And we've seen that, as I mentioned earlier, in appointments that are made. It's a perfect kind of like tokenism that emerges. And I think the central point about the discourse is like, who's leading the discourse? Where are the erasures occurring? And what is the relationship between the language and the vocabulary? So for me, it then leads to sort of this idea of accountability, and
just to sort of circle back just a little bit, sorry, to sort of this historical framework that you've laid out, and the way in which we have this tripartite segregation of Black, Indigenous, and white, and as we talked about, as you said, that like essentially in the wake of these movements, we've sort of had like a mainstream discourse that says there's only two different kinds of racism, anti-Black racism and anti-Indigenous racism, and anything in between. Of course, God forbid we even talk about Afro-Indigenous people. Anything in between is just sort of like a weird amorphous blob. And really, how then these kinds of ideas incentivize artists to perform a certain kind of mandated identity, right? Where there are analogs drawn between vastly different struggles from like the Asian and South Asian diasporas, and sort of equivocating them one-on-one with the horrific experiences of transatlantic slavery and the experiences of the Black Atlantic diaspora, or of the displacements of many Indigenous nations and their sequestering on reserves. So I find it really interesting the ways in which this works quite in lockstep with our rhetoric around truth and reconciliation, which is quite heavy on sort of a performed reconciliation and quite obscure in terms of many truths, as we're seeing unfold as well in various parts of the country at 1492 Landback Lane, in Mi'kmaq territories currently. So yeah, I just wanted to sort of put a small point on that before we move on to accountability.
Yeah, and you're absolutely right. I mean, we did talk a little bit about this, and I think also kind of this, and the kind of discourses that we've chosen to adopt, I mean, just in the idea of talking about, the sort of, how we prioritize or give primacy to something. I'm just thinking of like, the there's like a British Black movement that had its own discourse that came out of, a very specific condition of Margaret Thatcher dismantling virtually everything in the sort of early mid 70s. It's all kind of the historical conditions of it, and then we have our own Canadian discourse around it and our own terminology like IPOC or IBOC. And then, of course, there's the United States discourse around it. And I think that what I'm seeing is like a kind of utilization of these discourses, not really geared towards the change that we want, but we've been caught and swept up, in speaking about and responding again to those manifestations that I described earlier, because what then, happens to people of color, or the idea of people of color as a term of whiteness, in this. So that's kind of, where I feel like we really have to, on that question of vocabulary, we need to really think about what we're using and how we're using it. And I think we talked about this, right? Like the trend is how the 1980s vocabulary was usurped and repackaged and deployed with a completely kind of changed import.
Yeah, definitely. We talked about this specifically in relationship to how organizations react when they are called out on issues of racial bias and profiling and discrimination, which is to do in standard procedure, an internal review, right? Which is very much a product of 80s neoliberal corporate culture, where we defer accountability from a public body, which has an obligation to its public, to sort of something internally done by an arts body or a corporation, that virtually has no real need to be accountable to anybody.
Yeah. And I also just like, and I kind of want to also just sort of touch on this sort of idea of the concept of difference, right? Like the race discourse, equality, affirmative action, etc., were products of that strand. And I think we also need to understand like the genesis of the overbearing of business leadership on these issues from, again, 1987, right? With the Reagan administration, and this report came out from the Rand Corporation. It was called Workforce 2000. And that report essentially predicted in 1987 that the challenge to the United States industry in terms of workforce would have to grapple with like the globalization that was forthcoming in the 21st century, and that there was a need to diversify the labor force. And so that the U.S. manufacturing sector would be able to capture and dominate the global market. That report was debunked eventually, but what I wanted to say here is that we have very quickly adopted all of that, and I want to just talk about this is why this whole discussion of diversity and inclusion has come out of that. It's about productive. It's got nothing to do with systemic racism. Whilst the report itself was kind of, dumped, it was really picked up by management discourse in the U.S. academia. And it's produced kind of really kind of particular corporate practices. I mean, I've heard so much culture sector, kind of adopt and pick this up as if this is going to be the savior and deal with the systemic racism that we're asking them to deal with, right? And just sort of like very quickly how we've used terms like, unconscious bias, et cetera, et cetera. But I think that these practices really focused on productivity and market, on labor productivity and market.
Right.
And that labor was not addressing equality at all, right?
Right. And in the same way, we are kind of on the precipice now where all of the productive rhetoric that's been generated by grassroots movements throughout the summer and the earlier part of the year is actively in the process of being packaged and commodified into artistic production or cultural production. So yeah, I guess in that way we're sort of naturally veering towards institutions a little bit, and I think maybe this is a good time to sort of talk about a little bit in depth the way in which institutions have defined art, value, and labor, and how they relate to the state and to sort of its public or its putative public.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think that, what we've really seen is that with the change being forced on everyone, and we're under these intense time frames and different experiences are coming down to kind of personal attitudes and reactions to change. And I think the crisis has really put, cultural institutions around the world on the verge of economic collapse. And there's no quick fast track back to normal. There is no possibility of that. We cannot think that what we want to do is restore what we were before. It does not make sense. It's not where we need to go. And I think the bigger takeaway for us today in this discussion is that we need to really interrogate every aspect of working rather than defaulting to how things were done pre-COVID, right? We need to shift and reframe our thinking. And when I think of the crisis, I'm really seeing it in the institutions. All the public institutions are definitely in crises. They're cultural institutions, the universities, public institutions, are actually where the crisis is really clearly situated. And we're not surprised by this because it's unfolded in a kind of a rapid pace over the last 2 decades, right? Is that we've been, and what's a way to understand it, I think, is really like to discuss the work of the artist, right? And understand the political economy of the arts. I think that for us, in terms of institutions, we need to do certain things. And for example, I want to say that we need to engage the state, right? For example, through the Massey Report. And just in case people don't know what it is, it was Canada's Royal Commission on the National Development in the Arts, Letters and Sciences, and known as the Massey Report. And it is actually the policy document that provided the armature for what would become the state-defined national culture in Canada. And it defines who an artist is and what is Canadian art. And it, for example, has not allowed us to grow. It has robbed agency from artists, right? It has not allowed us to think and open up the places. And all the public institutions, cultural institutions, universities, they completely have not created places where we can think through things. They actually represent the neoliberal apparatus, right? Complete with its managerialism, with its value chains, supply chains. And so the idea of welfare today is connected to the labor market, which looks completely obsolete. Anyway, I think that just to go back to where we've come to because of what's happened in this neoliberalization of those institutions, I see that we've also kind of arrived at this political separation between work, labor, and jobs. And this is where I think the whole status of the artist is a real point of focus for us, and it should be, right? Because artists earn 43% less than general labor. It's atypical work. And most of all, I must say that our dignity is lost, right? And that we can't have these, Band-Aid solutions of, one exhibition, one community art project, because we keep responding to those manifestations. Homelessness is a great one, right? We open up more homeless shelters, but that doesn't mean homelessness will disappear. The same with hunger, right? More food banks, but the issue of hunger is not actually being addressed. So, and I think, Vince, we also talked about then what is that link, to the individual, right? Because I talked a little bit about artists and then back to the individual. So.
Yeah, well, just to go back to some of our notes. I think one of the things that I also wanted to quickly bring up before we move on to the question about the individual was the way in which cultural production as defined by the Massey Report has also changed in the context of kind of neoliberal turns in economics to the point that we have now essentially justified art as a kind of public good, which and sort of packaged it within sort of a value system that favors an unequal form of development. So maybe we can just briefly touch on that, which will give us a bit of a segue into the individual.
Yeah, I mean, the Massey-Levesque report, for me has, and the kind of neoliberalization that has occurred has really, what's happened, I think, is that it's, what we've done is instrumentalize everything, right? And so that's really what's happened, right? That report is set up as a mother policy document, but the way that we have unfolded all of that through the neoliberalized process, it has actually just instrumentalized everything we think about art, and its economic imperatives, and now its social imperatives, right?
Right.
And we've moved away from, and we've been forced into, sort of thinking about art as a particular way. You can see this when, the NAFTA was occurring and the formation of the world, the WTO, right? The World Trade Organizations were called. We were fighting for how culture should be exempt from those things, but we've been commodified straight into it, and we've been instrumentalized into certain modes of behavior, and this is how this is the ways to respond, right? My best way of thinking about it is like when I served the art gallery sector, is when the art gallery sector started to become, extensions of rec and parks. When suddenly you're seeing yoga and Zumba and dance and everything else is happening. And so the state, or the local government, has put onto the art gallery its work, and even how the self now has become neoliberalized.
Right. And I think some of my critical work deals with this idea that the arts have become an extension not only of Parks and Rec, but in some cases sort of this new tech startup complex as well, right? So much of the Toronto Biennial, its siting, its location on the waterfront, kind of worked in a complementary way with Sidewalk Labs and its ambitions to develop those areas. Of course, that's now defunct. But there's also this idea of like sort of the creative class that we talked about in Richard, Florida, and all of the damage that that's done to our ability to sort of mobilize in solidarity as a common economic class of workers, right? In ways that we constantly sort of set ourselves apart from other sorts of workers because somehow we are rarefied and special. And it's also similarly undercut the ability for racialized artists to act in solidarity because there is so much emphasis placed on this idea of the neoliberal self, and then sort of situated within these kind of nebulous terms, what I call the healing industrial complex. Mm-hmm. This idea that somehow the arts have to become this panacea, right? And that artists then have to sort of tackle these complex social issues with rhetoric around, nebulous things like care. What does care actually mean here? Or sort of the idea of ancestors. I mean, like, which ancestors are we invoking? So it puts us in this position of having to push back and having to articulate a certain kind of refusal when institutions position us in this way, when institutions, in lieu of changing systemic issues of racism, will create an emerging artists program, underpay these emerging artists, and then position them sort of in many ways against an already operating class of artists who are also underemployed, right? We have this constant sort of myth of the pipeline. And it's like, well, there are already qualified and skilled individuals. It's just they're not being platformed. So, it really kind of makes me think of the Coming Insurrection, which is like a manifesto by the Invisible Committee, in that certain words are like battlegrounds. Their meaning, revolutionary or reactionary, is a victory to be torn from the jaws of the struggle, right? And yeah, I guess we're sort of drawing to a close. There were a few other things we wanted to touch on, but I guess we'll have to leave that to Q&A. But if you had any closing remarks, Zainub?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like we're just beginning the conversation, and I know that we are really at the end. I think that, there's so much more to be said, but I just want to say really quickly that, art has kind of exited, right? It's not even in the language anymore. It's like sports, entertainment, and tourism. And I don't know where the art has gone now. But the other thing I want to say, just because I felt that it was important to kind of think about, if we can, what is the big takeaway from the discussion? And it's that we really need to interrogate every aspect of how we are working rather than defaulting to what we've done. We're definitely going to face uncertainty, and it's really important to navigate the extended period of turbulence that we encounter. I want to just say that it's really important to understand your history and not fall for myopic or appropriated narratives of the issue. Dig deeper. I think that we need to have agency and moral courage. We really need to have moral courage. We cannot be afraid to speak on that. I can come to that again if we can. And I just think there's things we can do in terms of work. We've got basic income. We can fight for those things. You can demand for basic income, for example. But another thing I just want to say is, if you're working in an institution that has a diversity and inclusion framework, dismantle it. That's what we can do. These are the kinds of actions we can do and take our agency back and respond. If we do not want to, if we want a very different world, we're going to have to take action. So I'm going to just stop there.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, I feel similarly for emerging colleagues that we demand better pay, that we don't settle for honoraria that barely support our living costs, that we also, given the nature of this crisis, we've realized how interdependent we are, so that we don't choose individual means towards career building at the expense of our communities, at the expense of the networks that sustain us when the arts ecosystem cannot. And yeah, I guess that's our takeaway. I guess we'll go to questions now.
Yes. Thank you so much, Zainub and Vince, for that incredibly generative conversation. That was really great to witness. So I just want to let everyone know now that we're just going to have a really quick, question and answer period now. So I think we should have the option to unmute and be able to verbally ask questions if people want. You can also directly message me with a written question if you would like. I do already have a question here to start us off. So the first question, okay, yes. So the person sent it again. Amazing. Can I identify you by name? Who asked the question? Okay, I'll just read it. Sorry. So I recently came across a curated show, The Pandemic is a Portal, named after Arundhati Roy's now famous essay in the Financial Times. What does it mean to think of such curatorial gestures as further extending both the pandemic and artistic practice into a space of a kind of neoliberal co-optation? How can we, as cultural workers, artists, and writers, unbind ourselves from falling into this trap of making the pandemic an aesthetic spectacle to be consumed like any other art object in a gallery? The show in question was packaged as a way to think about structures of care and times of care, especially amongst artists and art workers. I wonder what it might mean for the discourse of care itself to be packaged as a product in times of crisis or otherwise. That was a really great question. I don't know who wants to speak to that first.
I can speak to it a little bit because I think I know the show that we're talking about. Of course, the person asking the question also posted that Pandemic is a Portal article, which the curator of that particular show lifted from their Instagram account and turned into the basis for their show. Of course, this was an article that was written about the tremendous crisis that India is facing right now, that's been baked into several hundred years old caste system, and a hierarchy of oppression, a discourse on purity, very kind of socially embedded narratives, which have then been sort of lifted and abstracted into I'm not entirely sure what. There is this kind of vague alterity that it gestures towards, and invokes community a number of times. But what that community is, what care looks like is never really articulated. And this is kind of part of the problem. I have not been able to actually write anything about the show itself because I've reviewed one of the curator's shows before quite harshly and met with a lot of backlash. And really, it means then that there are no effective means of articulating a public critique of something like that. And so the only real option then seems to be for more people on an individual basis to refuse and reject those kinds of definitions, right? To really integrate what care means. In fact, I've kind of disposed care from my vocabulary. I like to think of things as mutual aid rather than care. And to sort of think about care as a more radical gesture than its neoliberal co-option. I don't know if Zainub had more to say.
I'm not sure that I've got really that much more. I mean, I think it's not that, I would say that it's not really, it's not, fostering any new thinking. It's not allowing us to go any deeper. It's really just kind of an illustration of something more than like making us dig in, I would say, right? It's kind of maybe regurgitation of some kind. But I think you articulated the response. I don't think I can really add much more to that. I think it's, about listening, right? So those are sort of the few things I could say to that on top of what you've already said.
Thank you. I guess, does anybody else have any more questions?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I haven't received any written questions, so if anyone wants to verbally ask the question, you can do that now. If we don't hear from anyone in the next, 20, 30 seconds, then I will just pass it off to Lakshana to move more into the general AGM. In the meantime, while we're waiting to hear back from everyone, I just want to say thank you so much, Vince and Zainub, for, again, your contributions today.
Thank you, Roya. I think Jamie and Ricky have questions. Ricky raised their hand first.
Well,
if it's okay. Sorry, go ahead. I'm not Ricky.
No, go ahead. No, my question was already asked, actually, so that's fine.
Yeah. Ricky's was the first question.
Okay. Jamie, would you be able to ask your question? And then I have one more after that.
Sure. If it's okay, I don't actually have a question. I'm sorry. I just wanted to relate in terms of the Massey report and what it did for that whole idea of defining art. And I seem to recall, that there wasn't even anything in there about intangible knowledge. And I think that was something that was probably detrimental for a lot of folks as well. I learned a lot here today, and I work for the National Gallery of Canada, and I'm on our restructuring committee of our environment, and it's a big task that diversity and inclusion framework, the thing that we just worked on.
Tell Jonathan I'd say hi.
So I just, this was important for me to be here. It's my first CARFAC meeting, and I'm learning a bit. So thank you very much, both of you.
So I'd say, Jamie, you've got some work to do at the National Gallery versus the D&I framework. It really is something that I think we need to dismantle, because it is astounding to me how many art and cultural organizations have rushed out to create those frameworks, and no one is actually addressing systemic racism. No one.
And a lot of, speaking specifically to the National Gallery, a lot of this diversity and inclusion mandate actually really comes from a crisis in collecting, right? Because of so much Western contemporary art is now too expensive to acquire, the National Gallery's curators have been venturing further and further afield to try to kind of snatch up works from artists in developing markets, in South Asia, in China and Japan. It's really interesting because, I think again, it becomes an economic imperative rather than one that's about equity. And what's also interesting, we were going to talk about this a little bit, is that disruption in knowledge circuits, right? The idea that intangible knowledge isn't a part of what we define as Canadian culture, well, a national culture, or even like a culture of this place, means that we can have these scripts rewritten at any time by kind of hegemonic structures, right? We can have ideas of who we are kind of dictated to us specifically because of this rupture in the transfer of knowledge. And I think that's also a site at which we can act at the moment. And I think, I also see so much at a grassroots level of attempts to remedy that, of transmitting that knowledge, and of sustaining those communities in that way.
Okay. So thank you, Vince, for that very thoughtful answer. Thank you both for your time. At this point, we are going to move forward into the AGM. So I'm going to pass that over to Lakshana. Thank you all so much.
Thank you so much for bearing with us and for bringing all of your wonderful insights.
Yeah, I really want to also say thank you. And to anyone who's working on this, that piece about the moral courage, it's really important, because that's where we can make that shift that we need to. Tim Porteous was one director at the Canada Council, and he actually, I just use him as an example, he went against government's legislation to bring crown corporations under more control, and he really defied the government. It's so much when he was at the Canada Council, for example, that he was not even reappointed for a second term, but his legacy is really legendary. Now, we can talk about council as a whole different thing, but all I'm trying to say is that the moral courage is really, really important. And it's been a really interesting conversation. Hopefully we can have more.
Yeah, and please do reach out to us, because we'd very much like to hear from you and continue this conversation. I guess we can post that information in a follow-up email or on the event page. I don't know. Well, I guess I'll just type up my email address if you want to write to me, or Zainub. But yeah, looking forward to hearing from all of you.